the session so that we can share it with others. And there we go. And for those of you who are co-hosts, and I'm going to make near of you a co-host as well, feel free to keep letting folks in, and everybody knows enough to use the chat for questions as we go. Isaac, do you want to start?
Yeah, so good morning, everyone. I'm Isaac Benowitz. As Dr. Shaw mentioned, I'm a new state epidemiologist. Really excited to be here and really appreciate everyone's time this morning and looking forward to working with many of you in months and years to come. So we're going to talk about a few things this morning. We're going to review the current COVID-19 outpatient therapies with a focus on the monoclonal antibodies. We'll share some updates on what we know so far on some of the new COVID therapies that we're expecting to see in the next few weeks and months, including 2 oral antivirals and 1 long-acting antibody. Talk a little bit about federal and state distribution and sort of what that means for clinical workflows, and talk a little bit about sort of how to think about some of these new therapies coming out in the context of what we already have. But we really also have time for Q&A and want to make sure that there's space here for discussion. So Lisa, let me turn this over to you to talk a bit about sort of where we are with monoclonals already.
Sure. So, I think one key thing for clinicians is that we are purposefully sort of bookending this discussion this morning with a reference to monoclonals because we have them, we know that they work, and we want to encourage providers to use them more. So there's 3. I won't go through all this. I think hopefully you've all seen at some point, but what we refer to as BAM-EDI, as one, REGEN-COV, and then the newer one, sotrovimab, and they're all FDA authorized for the treatment. Similarly, for the treatment of mild to moderate COVID, for non-hospitalized patients, there's another monoclonal that's used in the hospital setting, but focusing on clinicians in the ambulatory setting. All 3 should be used for individuals who have a diagnosis of COVID and are at high risk for developing severe COVID. We'll talk about that more in a minute, or in the setting of post-exposure prophylaxis. The big difference between the 3 is REGEN-COV is the only one right now authorized to be given sub-Q. Go ahead. So we're trying to prioritize the use of the others when IV infusion can be given. The key thing here is to remember that they have been shown to be quite effective, at least in the current mix of viruses that we're aware of. It's possible that this could change as things continue to evolve. But as you can see here, both BAM-EDI and REGEN-COV, which is the casirivimab and imdivimab, about 70% reduction of severe COVID requiring hospitalization or death, and then sotrovimab around 85%. So pretty good performance. There was some concern early on about the use of bamlanivimab when the Alpha variant was around and people sort of got used to not using it. But with Delta, it's been shown the combination has been shown to be effective with in vitro testing. So again, we're encouraging use of all 3. Go ahead. There's not really an argument to be using one over the other. Because there is a constrained supply right now, the feds gave the authority or the responsibility to the states about, 2 months or so ago, to allocate the limited supply of monoclonals. And because it's a limited supply, we have asked clinicians to prioritize use to individuals who are diagnosed with COVID, not routinely in the post-exposure prophylaxis setting. However, also for post-exposure prophylaxis in high-risk congregate settings, such as long-term care settings and correctional facilities, and specifically for individuals at high risk for progressing to severe COVID, which, as you can see, is quite a list, including age 65 and over, BMI 25 and over. That's a whole lot of people in the state of Maine, right? So if you're not thinking about it for your patients, be thinking about it. Be thinking about it at the time you do the test so that you're teeing up in your mind and theirs that they might be a candidate excuse me, for one of these therapies, whether it's the monoclonals or, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, one of the orals, but these are available now. We should be thinking about and using these. Go ahead. And we are really trying to get at these high-risk individuals, both to try to avoid the development of severe disease, but also to limit the continued deluge of patients into our, as you all know, incredibly overstretched hospitals and ICUs. We really want to prevent people from getting very sick. There are 41, actually I think we're now up to 42 registered organizations that can provide monoclonals. You can see a mix of hospitals, infusion centers, urgent care, few primary care. I'd love to see more, and corrections. But the challenge is that it's not always easy to figure out where those are. Go ahead. And only a subset of those actually make themselves available, because obviously DOC, well, you could make themselves available, but you're not going to be sending people into jail for it. And a few of the smaller primary care, don't feel that they have the capacity to take folks from the public. So we did, and I'll put in the chat, or if anybody, one of my colleagues can track it down, but I'll put in the chat when I'm done talking, the link. We have posted a list of those facilities that are accepting people, from private referrals. Some are coming through the EDs, et cetera. And we're going to keep updating that list. But if you don't know where to send somebody, please make it your job to find out in your community. And you can always contact me if that's not easy to figure out. We have had limited supply, as I mentioned, but we can move doses around. That's not uncommon, particularly in the setting of outbreaks. Folks will contact us and say, we need 20 more doses, and the existing providers, many of whom are represented on the phone here today, have been incredibly gracious and generous about doing that. But again, patients are not always aware. The goal is to give the treatments within 10 days of symptom onset, which, as we know, between the lag of somebody saying, I don't think it's COVID, oh, maybe it's COVID, where am I going to find a test? I'm going to get the results. That 10 days goes by very quickly, right? So be thinking about it upfront when you're doing the test. Go ahead. If you're doing the test, right? A lot of them are doing their own tests. There is a pretty good mix. You can see across the state, there should be availability somewhere not too far from you and your patients. Go ahead. And then there is this online treatment locator as well, which is not 100% accurate, but it's pretty good. And you can put in a zip code. But again, if you can't figure out where to go, feel free to contact me or one of us. Go ahead. And then with that, I'm going to turn it back to Isaac to talk about the newer kid on the block, the oral antivirals.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Lisa. So thanks for that overview of monoclonals. Hopefully really, good information to reinforce stuff that we've had around for a while now, but certainly that we need to get to more patients. So this is sort of a preview. There are 3 drugs that I'm going to talk about that are coming to market within the next several weeks. The first one is a Merck drug called Mandu Pyrovir. It is, so it's a SARS-CoV-2 replication inhibitor. It initially got a lot of really good attention because the initial data looked like it had a 50% reduction in hospitalization or death compared to placebo. And those of you following the news closely may have seen just within the last week or so that number has been downgraded to 30%. So still a really valuable treatment, but really right at the outset, I just want to highlight that this needs to be given within the first 5 days of symptom onset, and the effectiveness against hospitalization or death is really not at the level of monoclonals. Treatment is given as 800 milligrams twice a day for 5 days. And a few other key features with regards to prescribing. It will require a confirmed COVID-19 molecular test, so a PCR or antigen test. And there's a concern around the toxicity profile. In particular, it was not studied in pregnant women because the mechanism is essentially to create mutations and inhibit replication. There's concern about the immunogenicity. And so it can't be used in pregnant women, and that may require a test, or it may simply require counseling and a questionnaire. And we're not sure yet what that will look like. We're really looking to FDA to define that, hopefully in coming days. The other important thing to know right now is that the initial supply is quite constrained. There is an allocation plan that divides up the initial batches of this drug to states based on population, not based on current surges. And so we're excited and eager to bring this to patients in Maine, but it will not be widely available initially. Talk a little bit about that later on. The second oral drug coming down the line, and this is going to be a little farther out, is a Pfizer drug called Paxlovid. This one is also intended to be given within 3 to 5 days of symptom onset. Also for patients with mild to moderate COVID-19, but this one shows an effectiveness of 85 to 89% against hospitalization or death, depending on when it's initiated. This one needs to be given with a second drug, ritonavir, and so it's given as 2 Paxlovid plus 1 ritonavir for 5 days. Similarly, we'll require a confirmed molecular test, and again, we're expecting the initial supply to be quite constrained, and we're still waiting on our federal partners to give us more details of exactly what that constrained initial supply will look like. And then in addition to those 2 oral antivirals, there's also a long-acting antibody drug from AstraZeneca, currently just called AZD7442, that is intended for pre-exposure prophylaxis of symptomatic COVID-19. And so this is something that is really intended for immunocompromised patients or immunosuppressed patients. It's something that is given as a single administration and then lasts for, I believe, 6 months, but I need to pull those details. And so this one, really think about this as similar mechanism to the monoclonal antibodies, but a very different target population, really targeting immunosuppressed or immunocompromised patients, and not given after onset, but given as prophylaxis. So back to the oral antivirals, the Mandu Pyrovir and Paxlovid. We're still waiting on details of what our constrained supply is going to look like. We've seen some information suggesting that the initial allocation for Maine for Mandu Pyrovir might be around 1,600 treatment courses. Unclear whether that's going to be for all of December or just weekly throughout December. As I mentioned, allocation is to states, and beyond that, the states have sort of been empowered to designate the distribution routes. And so we had a call Tuesday morning with several of the chain pharmacy systems and with some hospital partners as well to start to get them excited about helping to bring this drug to Mainers. And we're still working through the best way to do that in terms of which pharmacies and potentially which hospitals will have this drug in the initial wave and which ones will get it within several weeks after that. This particularly the Monoclonal Pyrovir, with the concern around pregnancy, poses some additional challenges beyond what we sort of think about for other therapeutics. Regardless of which of these drugs you're looking at, patients are going to need a test before they can get it. That could happen in your office, and then they could simply get a prescription for the drug. But we're also trying to get to the point where we can simply tell a patient, if you think you have COVID, go to the pharmacy, get the test, get the drug, one-stop shopping. The indications for the oral antivirals are not yet finalized. We're anticipating that those criteria will be quite similar to the monoclonal antibodies, by which we mean patients diagnosed with COVID-19, likely with mild to moderate illness, so that they can be in the outpatient setting as opposed to hospitalized, and patients who are at high risk for severe disease, with the exact details yet to come. Really, what we want to emphasize at this point, and part of the reason that I asked Lisa to review some of that information on monoclonals at the beginning of this session, is that given the greater efficacy of the monoclonals and the initial limited supply of oral antivirals, really continue to think at this point about monoclonals as the drug of choice for patients with mild to moderate COVID-19 who are at risk for severe disease. The monoclonals can be given within the first 10 days. The oral antivirals need to be given within the first 5 days. We continue to recommend the use of monoclonals for high-risk populations, including congregate settings like long-term care and correctional. And that this is something that is very much an evolving terrain, and we're anticipating that as the second oral antiviral and possibly others come to market that have comparable efficacy to the monoclonals, it'll definitely be a shifting calculus in terms of what to get to which patients, but that we're not there yet. And so right now we really are thinking about these oral antivirals as filling in the gaps where we're not able to get monoclonals to
Maybe
patients.
that conference call.
So again, just sort of the key messages for the oral antivirals. The first one coming to market has a 30% effectiveness against hospitalization or death. We're still waiting on the emergency use authorization, which we hope will answer some of the questions in terms of which patients to prioritize and how to manage concerns around pregnancy. There's a very limited supply, and at least initially, and then we hope that will grow, but we don't have the time frame for that yet. The second oral antiviral, we're also anticipating within 1 to 2 months, but we just don't have a firm timeline yet. And that one, that's the Paxlovid from Pfizer, is more effective with comparable effectiveness to monoclonals. So for now, really focus on these as filling in gaps for monoclonal access. That was a lot of information. I realize that I talk fast when I've got a lot to cover. So let's unpack that. We've got about 10 minutes, and I'm going to turn off the slides and just go back on video and really invite folks to put questions in the chat or just to come off mute and share your thoughts and your concerns. As folks are starting to do that, I see that there's one question in the chat already. Katie Adams asked, are there any studies looking at administering both oral antivirals and monoclonal antibodies together? Katie, I'm so glad you asked that. That's definitely been on our minds. The short answer is no, we just don't know. The other short answer is that right now we're still looking at very constrained supplies, both for the monoclonals and for the oral antivirals. And so I think it would just be challenging to make an argument that one patient should be getting multiple drugs when there are so many patients behind them in line.
Great. And Nirav, I didn't know if you wanted to make a comment. You had said at the beginning there's just a little bit more info in the last 24 hours. Did you want to comment on that at all? Nirav still with us?
I think he may be on the phone in transit.
Oh, okay. So I don't know what the update was in the last 24 hours.
Yeah, well, I will say I've received some information. So our initial information suggested that that Mandu Pyrovir might get the EUA and start rolling out within days. FDA's advisory committee met on Tuesday and gave it the green light, but that's still waiting for the EUA. And so our expectation was that Mandu Pyrovir would move forward very quickly, and that the AstraZeneca long-acting monoclonal long-acting antibody would be several weeks out. But we got some initial information yesterday suggesting that the long-acting antibody drug may actually come to market sooner, and that it might potentially be weeks before we see the Mandu Pyrovir EUA. This is like in the realm of rumor, so we're trying to get ready to move these forward whenever they come. And it's, you know, we're plugged into all the federal partners, and this is still like the most closely guarded secret is when is this stuff actually going to show up. So trying to keep all of you on the leading edge.
And just to highlight again what you said earlier about the long acting, so just for everybody to remember, that is only going to be for immunocompromised folks, so that is, and also constrained supply, so that's probably only going to go to a handful of like the cancer centers and the bigger centers that are treating cancer patients and severely immunocompromised. So that's not going to be something widely available.
Yeah. Dr. Mills asked a great question: the efficacy of these drugs against the Omicron variant, particularly the monoclonal antibodies and the long-acting antibody. So we just don't know yet. I know that this is very much the hot topic that I believe FDA and other federal partners are asking the drug manufacturers to review as best they can the efficacy of their products against this new variant. But of course, because it's a new variant that was just discovered within the last few days to weeks, there are no existing data in terms of patient populations that were treated with these drugs when Omicron was already out. And so this is going to take in vitro studies, and we're hearing that we're going to have, big picture in terms of what Omicron means for this next phase of the pandemic. We're anticipating that we'll have some preliminary information within maybe 2 weeks in terms of characterizing clinical attributes. But some of the other information in terms of what it means for some of the therapeutics and vaccine, et cetera, is probably more like 6 to 8 weeks out at this point. And I'll bounce around a little bit. I saw another question from Jeff Barkin. Given the explosive growth of Omicron, are you aware of any early emerging data on efficacy of current vaccines? So yeah, again, it's not yet known. Big picture, based on the very little that we know right now, I'm anticipating that we'll see, somewhat similar efficacy of the vaccines against the Omicron variant. I mean, it's certainly a concerning variant given the number of mutations, several of which are in the spike protein. But the other thing that I'll say, from the epidemiologic perspective, the fact that it's emerging somewhat slowly in South Africa and a number of other countries suggests that resistance, that the effectiveness of the vaccine is actually still quite good. If this were truly a breakaway variant that the vaccine had no effectiveness against, we'd see it tearing across populations a lot faster, like China a year and a half ago. I see a question from Diane Zavotsky. What concerns are there about developing resistance to the oral drugs if overused? Once supply increases, I can anticipate patients putting lots of pressure on providers to get these drugs. And I share your concern, particularly with the Mandu Pyrovir, because the mechanism is essentially to induce mutations. I sort of think about this the same way that we message around antibiotics, that it's important to complete the course so that you don't generate more resistance and actually knock out what's in your body. And when the FDA panel met, there were concerns expressed around what all of this means. But we just don't know yet. It's definitely something that is on the radar. I think the other sort of overlapping question there is, what is our actual ability to ensure that these drugs are only going to the patients who meet the clinical indications and that it's not being stockpiled as a just in case or being given to asymptomatic COVID patients who just want to do absolutely everything to make sure that they don't progress. The terms of the emergency use authorization essentially dictate that anyone prescribing the drug agrees to adhere to the clinical requirements, but ultimately, there are no very firm controls over who can write it. There may ultimately be a bit more control in pharmacies where there's an expectation, or there will likely be an expectation to document some information to describe why a patient was able to get one of these drugs, but there are unanswered questions there. Nikki wrote in with a question, are these drugs and monoclonals only for unvaccinated patients? So this is another great and challenging question. A lot of focus has been on Mandu Pyrovir, and it was studied in an unvaccinated population. We won't have a final answer to this until we see the details of the emergency use authorization. At this point, I can say that our concern is for any patients that are at high risk for hospitalization and death. And part of what we're doing right now is digging into our data from the last few months about Mainers who are hospitalized, end up in the ICU, and die, to understand the characteristics. And if we see a level of concern there for vaccinated patients as well, then we may be able to include some of that group. Ultimately, some of this will probably be left to provider discretion, which is to say that if you go into a pharmacy where things are a bit more algorithm driven, it may be a more limited list of patients that can access it, but that we would also defer to clinicians who felt that a particular vaccinated patient was really deserving of one of these therapies. We have just 2 or 3 minutes left. Go ahead, Lisa.
Just one comment about that. So I've heard the comment before from providers, well, I could always do an off-label, use of the drug, but I believe I have heard you or Steve or Nirav clarify previously that when a drug is authorized, not fully approved, there is no such thing as off-label use. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Dr. Sears, do you want to say a little bit more about that? I think you may have a different perspective on it.
Sorry about that. I lost my mute button in the ozone on the bottom of the screen. Yeah, I think that there's always a temptation to use these drugs when you see somebody who's sick, but we really are, just like the vaccines, there are criteria for use that are the only criteria for use, and they really are not supposed to be used off-label because of these are not yet approved drugs. So I think Lisa and Isaac, you said it exactly for where we are at the moment. As they move along, they ultimately will get approved, similarly, like in a sense to the Pfizer vaccine. And then that changes the use criteria and the ability to use things in a different way.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, it's very, as Lisa and Stephen highlighted, it's very different from drugs that are fully approved. So we just have a minute left. I see. So Nikki, thank you for sharing your sort of like brief snapshot of what we know on Mandu Pyrovir. That's in the chat for those who want to look at those details. It's a helpful snapshot. I see one more question in two parts from Katie Adams. Are there any data looking at those who are hospitalized and previously received monoclonals? Can we demonstrate that it's working in our communities? So our data, the data that we currently collect, do not fully capture who received monoclonals or other therapeutics. That's something that we're keeping our eye on, because we would also like to understand sort of how that works in our population compared to other populations. But it's not something that we currently have data to present. But big picture, I think we have a high degree of confidence in the initial studies for these drugs, and so we don't have a particular reason to believe that they would be, much less effective in Mainers than in the original study population. So we're at 8 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and close here, but I really appreciate everyone taking the time to join us and to, get some of these initial details that are just coming. There's certainly a lot more to come in the next few weeks as these drugs actually hit the market. Lisa, Stephen, any other comments as we close?
No, thanks so much. So glad to have you on board, Isaac, as part of the team and able to share with clinicians. We have been holding a update on vaccines on this, what is it, Steve, the second Tuesday of every month, I believe,
Correct.
at 7:30. And so we thought maybe we were almost done with that. I think Steve and I were thinking it was the last one, but we have broadened it a bit the last time, and probably will again this time for an update on other therapies as well. So that would be Tuesday, December 14th. So essentially 2 weeks from now. So any other updates we have, we'll provide then. Okay, well, thank you all. And we'll post this recording probably in that same place that we usually put the Tuesday recordings if anybody's looking for that. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.